Hello and welcome back to the Consistory of the Coelc YouTube channel. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Jake Zabel of the St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. And today we're going to be looking at the topic of women preaching and teaching in the church. And this is continuing on my mini-series on the role of women in the church. So, as mentioned in previous videos, I wrote this paper and this book over here, as you can see, on the role of women laity in the church back in 2017 when I first left the Lutheran Church of Australia. So back then I was more in favour of lay ministry, but I drew the line between the use of lay women in the roles of lay ministry. Now in the coelc we don't allow for lay ministry. We don't have lay distributors in Holy Communion. We don't have lay preachers. But right now, I want to focus on the role of lay preaching. Now, in the coelc, we don't have lay preaching, but there are Lutheran churches out there that, for whatever reason, allow lay preaching to take place. And so this video is first and foremost for those congregations out there and those Lutheran churches in the world that do allow lay preaching to say, look, if you're going to let a layperson preach, at least limit it to men. But if you want to know what the coelc says on the topic of lay preaching in general, I've got multiple videos on this topic on this channel, so I'd recommend you go and check those out. Now, in the LCA's 2003 paper, Should Women Serve as Lay Readers in Public Worship?, the paper allows for women not only to lead the service, but to also preach a sermon. Now, this is clearly a violation of 1 Corinthians 14 and 1 Timothy 2, which say that women are not to speak publicly in the church, but are to learn in quietness and submission. So, the LCA tries to get around this by saying that 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy are not talking about speaking or teaching in general, but about individual authoritative leadership roles. And so I'd argue that then that would prohibit women from speaking and preaching in the church, because that is an independent, authoritative leading role. However, the LCA tries to make this distinction between speaking a sermon and teaching and preaching a sermon. And so this is something that we in the coelc strongly reject. Now, the early Lutherans in the Saxon Visitation articles drew a distinction between a layperson reading out a Bible lesson. They allowed for the kuster to read a Bible lessons in the absence of a pastor, but they forbade the kuster or layman from reading out a sermon, even if it was prepared by the pastor. Because when you simply read out the Bible lesson, that is simply a case of proclamation, but when you are actually reading out a sermon, whether or not you wrote it, you are now teaching and preaching on that particular verse. You're not just proclaiming something that you read out of a book, you're now actually teaching on the topic. Therefore, whether or not the sermon was prepared by a pastor, it is still a preaching and teaching position. Now, in the coelc, we don't allow even lay men to do that, but for those churches that have allowed men to do that, like the Lutheran Church of Australia, the Evangelical Lutheran Church, the Australian Evangelical Lutheran Church, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod, and so forth, they have allowed men to do this, but the LCA has taken a step further and also allowed women to do this. Now, the reason I would not let a man preach and teach in the church is because Scripture tells us in places like Hebrews 5:4 and also Romans 10:15 that nobody should preach or teach or take this honor upon themselves unless they've been called by the church. Whereas with women preaching and teaching in the church, we actually take this a step further, that not only have they not been called because they're not a pastor, but also women have been forbidden by 1 Corinthians 14 to speak and preach and teach in the church, and in 1 Timothy 2, women are not allowed to have authority over men in the church. They are not to have leadership roles in the church, but are instead told to learn in quietness and submission. So, therefore, we shouldn't have lay preachers in general, but we definitely should not have female lay preachers. That's like adding insult to injury. You're adding sin upon sin. It is already an error to have a lay person preach. It is a step further to allow a lay woman to preach. Now, I'm going to end our video here, and before we move on to our next topic, which is going to be on women lay lectors, so women reading the Bible lessons during the service, I first wanted to go through 5 different points on why women aren't allowed to preach and teach in the church. And this is really going to address also arguments for women's ordination. So in my book here that I wrote on the roles of women in the church, under this section of women preaching and teaching in the church, I gave 5 arguments that are normally put forth by the women's ordination group to say why women can preach and teach in church, and I'm going to give my responses to that. I could do that in this video, but then this video would be super long. So instead, I'm going to do 5 more videos addressing each one of those arguments. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.